The last G.E. Moore paper that we are reading for this semester is Moore's Defense of Common Sense. This paper was published in 1925, so well after the period when the first part of the history of analytic philosophy ends. Moore turns out to be a central figure in the early part and the later part, though. And the reason for his significance for the later part has to do with his defense of common sense and the way in which Moore influences some of the epistemologists in the 1950s as they're documenting the collapse of logical empiricism, logical positivism. The most important aspect of Moore on this score is his defense of common sense. He is a champion of common sense philosophy. We talked a little bit about that last time when we talked about the Moorean shift, where you don't give up the more obvious for the less obvious. As a result of his views, he was asked to explain what his views were and how his views disagreed with other people's views. That's what a defense of common sense is about. So, part one of the paper addresses what he thinks is true and what he thinks of those who disagree with each other, with him, and with each other, of course. But in any case, those who disagree are either self-refuting in the views that they hold, or their views are self-contradictory. Those are strong charges, and we'll see whether or not they hold up to scrutiny. But in any case, that's the first part of this paper, the defense of common sense. The second part of the paper discusses the problem of perception, and I'll talk a little bit about the history of Moore's thinking when we get to that. A preview, though, is relevant. There's a famous series of books called The Library of Living Philosophers that was edited by Paul Schilp. And what it did was it took people that were viewed as important enough in philosophy to deserve a book while they were still alive, rather than, as we usually do in philosophy, we talk about people after they're dead. In any case, one of the volumes is on Moore. There are also volumes on Russell and other people in the history of analytic philosophy. But in the one on Moore, for each such volume, the volume began with an intellectual autobiography by the philosopher in question. Moore's autobiography begins with the following kind of claim. Moore claimed he was never interested in the questions of philosophy at all. He had more of an engineering perspective on the world and intellectual matters. So why did he end up in philosophy? He said he wasn't interested in the problems of philosophy at all, but what irked him was all of the stupid, crazy things philosophers said that didn't stand up to scrutiny at all. So he ended up in philosophy because he thought he needed to correct the thoughts of major philosophers that he thought were loony, zany, crazy, something along those lines. That's an interesting perspective on Moore, and when we get to the second part of this defense of common sense, we are now in the mature period of G.E. Moore's thought, and what's interesting is that the problems of philosophy turned out to be inescapable. You can start out trying to refute the crazy things that other philosophers have said, and that's a good place to start. The problem is you can't end up there, because if you really take seriously the project, you start thinking that there are weaknesses in some of the earlier things that you said when you were trying to refute, or when you were actually refuting the thoughts of other philosophers. And then you start being grabbed by the problems of philosophy and trying to figure out how to solve them, in addition to trying to show that philosophers say lots of goofy things. In any case, we'll talk more about that when we get to part two of this paper. Let's focus first on part one. So part one begins with a long, boring list of things that Moore knows, and then he repeats these things for other people. There are ones like the first that other people know. He then says there are various misunderstandings that you might have that he wants to block you from having. Don't confuse what's on the list with claims that are thought to be partially true or partially false. He's an opponent of that. Don't think there are related positions, related propositions that are the only ones that are really true or false. And he says whether they're true or not depends on meaning. The answer is that the meaning is perfectly clear, but perhaps what is meant, i.e. the correct analysis, is not clear. Now, number 3 is a warning. Because philosophers often do this, and in fact you can find this in the history of philosophy going all the way back to people who are talking to Socrates. Somebody asks a straightforward question. Is it just to engage in insider trading on Wall Street? Is it just to do so? And philosophers often say, I think of these as sophomoric philosophers, but even if you don't insult them, they often say, well, that depends on what you mean by justice. And that's the charge, that's the response that Moore is talking about under number 3. The claim that, well, that depends on what X means, is a way of deflecting the question and not directly addressing or answering it. Moore is not a fan of that, and I think we have to side with Moore on this. The answer is no, it doesn't depend on what the word justice means. It depends on what justice is. So that's what I'm asking you. Is insider trading just? You need to tell me yes or no, because here's what justice involves. Don't say, well, that all depends on what justice means, the word justice means. It doesn't depend on what the word justice means. And Moore says the meaning is perfectly clear. And it is perfectly clear even though we can't give a correct analysis. Maybe the analysis of the term is really hard. So if you deflect the straightforward question about whether a particular act is just or not, if you deflect it into a question about the correct analysis of the term in question, you're just not facing the question. You are deflecting. Instead of answering the question, figuring out what justice is, you take a detour through the land of meaning, trying to give a correct analysis of the term. And maybe suggesting that the term in question is ambiguous, that there isn't any single thing which is justice, but there's just all sorts of different proposals about what the meaning of the term is. And if you go with one meaning, you get one answer, and if you go with another meaning, you get a different answer. This is philosophical subterfuge. It is sophistry of the worst sort. So Moore's defense of common sense says, don't do that. Point 3 is, don't confuse the list of things that I've given you with something that depends on meaning or ambiguity or is subject to such sorts of things. So, now that we have the lists in front of us, what about those who disagree? Here there are 2 kinds of disagreements. The first is metaphysical, the second is epistemological. So first, let's look at the metaphysical ones. There are those who disagree because they think that either some or all of the propositions on the list are not really true. Not really true because they imply the reality of material things, space, time, or selves. Notice here a hint of the idealist position again. Idealists will deny the reality of material things. Other philosophers deny the reality of space, time, or selves. So for selves, you can think about Hume. For space and time, think of the Kantian rejection of the reality of space and time in favor of a realist construal, in favor of, an idealist construal of space and time as the structure of our intuitions rather than something that is part of the real world itself. Here's More's response to these people. Their views are self-refuting. Why? Because if they are correct, if their views are true, then no philosopher ever existed who thinks that the propositions on the list are false. Such views, according to More, are not normally held consistently, for those philosophers who hold them usually refer to other philosophers and human beings. Now, More points out that their views are self-refuting, but that's not the same as their views being contradictory, and their views aren't contradictory. Instead, they are just self-refuting. So you should see the self-refuting charge as a kind of ad hominem argument. Ad hominem arguments have a suspicious standing in philosophy and in culture generally. We see ad hominem arguments, though, all over the place. Sometimes they're ways of trying to deflect and change the subject to avoid the force of a position or argument that is on the table. In that case, it's intellectually dishonest, disingenuous to engage in ad hominems. But if it's central to your position to hold that there are actually other philosophers who disagree with you about something, it's an astonishingly unreflective view to assert that while at the same time asserting that there aren't any selves in the universe. So More has a point here. Self-refuting is not the same thing as a contradictory view, but it's an intellectual, theoretical embarrassment to hold a view that is self-refuting. So the summary of the metaphysical one, the metaphysical response in a defense of common sense, is here. Their views might have been true. There is some epistemic notion of what might have been true that is true of their views because their views are not contradictory. So their views in some sense might have been true. They're at least logically consistent. The argument, however, that they are not true is just that the propositions on the lists are true. The propositions on the list, two lists that More starts with, are in fact true, and that gives you an argument against the claims of the people who disagree on metaphysical grounds. Notice this is just the Morean shift, again, that we talked about last time. When you refuse to give up the more obvious for the less obvious, you look at the people who deny the reality of material things, space, time, and selves, and you say, well, which is more obvious? The things on the list or the disagreeable philosophers' claims? If you refuse to give up the more obvious for the less, then you have a straightforward argument against such positions. All right, that completes the metaphysical response, the response to the metaphysical disagreeers with More's two lists. What about those that disagree on epistemological grounds? There are those who hold that we can't know with certainty that the propositions on the list are true. Here, More has a stronger position to defend. He claims that these people hold two things. They both hold that certain views are common sense views and that these views can't be known. That is, of course, an accurate assessment of this position. But then he wants to maintain that somehow A here is self-contradictory. So how are we going to get that out of this rather mundane expression of a kind of skepticism? How is it that the skeptic is supposed to be contradicting him or herself. Here's the argument. If certain views are common sense views, it follows that they are the views held by the majority of people who have bodies, etc., the sorts of things implied that are on the list of things that are the claims of common sense. Now, you should be furrowing your brow at this point. This claim is certainly true, but it doesn't look like that has anything to do with the view in question being self-contradictory, because this conditional claim itself is not self-contradictory. So we need something more than just this initial claim that if certain views are common sense views, then something follows about stuff on our list. How does that show that the expression of skepticism is self-contradictory? Here are more rephrases. In other words, to hold that certain propositions are identifiable as common sense views entails that some propositions on both lists are true. Now, what's crucial here to this Morean argument is that we got something new. We have this epistemic notion of what we can identify. So you're talking to the skeptic, and you're asking the skeptic to identify the common sense views in question that the skeptic holds can't be known to be true. And then once the skeptic claims to be able to identify certain views as common sense views, you accuse the skeptic of holding a self-contradictory view, because now you have a view, call it X, and the skeptic claims that he can identify X as a common sense view. But to identify something as a common sense view is to, what's the right way to put this? It's to have an epistemic success of a certain sort. You're at the police station. You have a whole bunch of people in a lineup, and the police officer says, "Can you identify the perpetrator?" And you say yes. Now, if you are a skeptic and you say, "Yes, I can identify the perpetrator," the policeman ought to look at you askance and say, "I thought you were a skeptic. I thought you couldn't know anything. How can you claim to be knowing something, not knowing something, and yet knowing it because you can identify? Do you know who the perpetrator is?" If you're a skeptic, you have to say no, and yet you're telling me you can identify the perpetrator. Aren't you embarrassed by this? Now notice what Moore has to be doing here is claiming that the skeptic has to be able to identify certain propositions as common sense views, and if you can identify something as a common sense view, then you know that it's a common sense view. Now you have an inconsistency attributable to the skeptic, because the skeptic will both hold that he knows that a view is a common sense view and that he doesn't know that these are common sense views. That's the heart of the Morean argument here. Notice that it depends on forcing the skeptic to identify things on the list as common sense views. A smart skeptic here will just demur. The skeptic will say, "No, you tell me. You tell me what are the common sense views, and then I will argue, I will show you why they can't be known to be true." There's a long history in discussions of skepticism of people trying to show that the skeptic cannot coherently articulate his skepticism. From that, of course, it doesn't follow that they're logically inconsistent. But people, less skeptical philosophers, have often thought or claimed that they could embarrass the skeptic further. So you ask the skeptic, what do you take to be true? And if the skeptic says, I take it to be true that nobody ever knows anything, now the non-skeptical philosopher will say, or be disposed to say, well, that's awkward of you to say. Why are you saying it? Are you saying that you know that nobody ever knows anything? If that's what you're saying, that's an incoherent remark. So the skeptic needs to say, I am saying that nobody ever knows anything, and no, I don't know that that's true either. That's an awkward position to be in at some level, but it's not a self-contradictory one. So remember, Moore takes his task to be showing that the skeptic is holding a self-contradictory position. To get to that conclusion is hard. To get to the embarrassing position where the skeptic has to say, nobody ever knows anything, and no, I don't know that either. That may be embarrassing or awkward or somehow pragmatically inappropriate to say in public, but it's not a self-contradictory claim. So the entirety of the argument here depends on this notion of identification. Can the skeptic identify something as a common sense view while at the same time denying that he or she knows that it's a common sense view? Moore has to argue that the notion of identification in question has to be a notion that's sufficient for knowledge. He hasn't done that. But you can see how the discussion is going to need to go. In any case, those are the two fundamental ways in which Moore tries to undermine the views of philosophers who disagree with him. There is both the undermining of metaphysical disagreeers on the basis of the Moorean shift. Their views might be true, but the best argument that they aren't true is the list itself and what's on it. Then there are the skeptics who say, yeah, there are common sense views, but common sense views don't count as knowledge. These views can't be known to be true because knowledge of this sort of thing is just not possible. Here, Moore's argument is less compelling and needs fleshing out further. It needs further discussion of why the notion of identification that Moore is relying on is itself an epistemic notion sufficient for knowledge. Then we turn in the second half of the paper. I'm skipping some of this, but the second half of the paper talks about the theory of perception itself. Now, if you go back to the refutation of idealism and you ask yourself the question that idealists asked, how can we ever get outside the circle of our own ideas? And the idealist answer was, you can't, because they're ideas. You're stuck with your ideas. Moore's answer was, you need to attend to the logical form of mental state descriptions a bit better than you have. There's a difference between a property of an object and the object of a mental state. We represent an object, X, having a property P this way. We represent a mental state having some object in a different way. Why do we do that? Because the metaphysical relationship of property possession is a quite distinct phenomenon from a mental state having a particular object. In this case, I'm using P as a propositional variable. But mental states can take propositions as their objects. They can also take ordinary physical objects as their objects. But Moore's view is it doesn't matter what the content, not his use of the word content, but it doesn't matter what the object of consciousness is. You're automatically outside the circle of your own ideas because here's the stuff of the circle of ideas, and that's an operator on something that is not itself an idea, or at least need not be. All right, that was a very simple, straightforward account, but notice it tends to be rather cavalier with ideas about hallucinations, after images, being trapped in the matrix, being caught in a Cartesian evil demon world, cases where you have an object of consciousness in terms of a propositional content or something like that, and yet you're not automatically outside the circle of your own ideas because the content is something that's completely illusory. There is nothing in the external world that it's accurately reporting. Now, perhaps the proposition itself is an abstract entity that is not itself an idea, but that's not More's point of view in The Refutation of Idealism. His point of view is, as soon as you get propositional content of any sort as the object of consciousness, the idealist loses. By the time we get to a defense of common sense, he thinks the problem is a little bit harder than what he thought when he wrote The Refutation of Idealism. So a couple decades later, we're now in a position where here's what he says. Though it's obvious that we know many things, it's not obvious what we know when we know. For example, that this, not his, this is a hand. What does the word this refer to? Not to the hand itself, he says, but at best only to the surface of a hand. Now, what would make a philosopher say such a goofy-sounding thing? I mean, if I walk in, I wish we were in class together. I'd walk in, I'd hold up my hand, and I'd say, this is a hand. And then I ask you, what does the word this refer to? The most obvious thing for you to say to me is, that hand. I mean, after all, what else could it be referring to? The chalkboard? My head? No. This is a hand. The word this refers to a hand. But More says it can't refer to the hand itself. At best, it can only refer to the surface of the hand. What would motivate More to say such a goofy-sounding thing? I think the answer is this. Think about how perception works. I hold up my hand and I say, this is a hand. What are you perceptually acquainted with? It's easy to start being more careful than to say, I'm acquainted perceptually with a hand. That sounds to me to be correct. You are acquainted with a hand. But there's a certain frame of mind that says, no, you can't see the back of the hand. I mean, look at the moon. All you can see is the surface that is facing you. You cannot see the back side of the moon. You're not seeing the back side of the moon. Look at my hand. You're not seeing the back side of my hand. You're only seeing the side that's facing you. So the word this can't refer to anything that you're not perceptually acquainted with, and you're not perceptually acquainted with the backside of my hand until I flip it around, and then you're no longer perceptually acquainted with the other side of my hand. Something like that, the connection between successful reference for demonstratives and indexicals as well, but demonstratives like this and that, is that they have to pick out something that you're perceptually acquainted with. As we will see, this is a point of view that More gets from Russell. So Russell holds this acquaintance view about demonstratives and defends it at length. More did not come up with this view on his own. He got pressed into accepting this by Russell's defense of the view. The result of this is that More ends up having to take the problem of perception much more seriously than he was willing to do when he thought he could refute certain claims made by idealists just by pointing out the logical form of mental state ascriptions. So a couple of things worth noting here. More starts out saying, I'm not interested in the problems of philosophy at all, but only in the goofy things that philosophers say, and the need to correct them. So you can see in the refutation of idealism that sort of frame of mind. You can also see some of it in proof of an external world. That turned out to be important in getting Russell to abandon his early idealism. But once Russell abandons his idealism, he's gripped by the problems of philosophy and addresses them directly and carefully. Moore and Russell are hanging out together, and Russell convinces Moore that it's not just goofy things that philosophers say that are perplexing. It's that the problems themselves can't be handled as easily as what you were thinking when you wrote The Refutation of Idealism. You don't automatically get outside the circle of your ideas merely by having an idea that has an object in terms of a proposition or physical object. There's nothing about having an object of consciousness that guarantees all by itself that you're outside the circle of your own ideas. The problems of illusion, hallucination, just making things up, can't be avoided quite so easily. So here, in A Defense of Common Sense, we get Moore's acknowledgement that it's very hard to escape the problems of philosophy just by criticizing the goofy answers that some philosophers have given to these problems. Notice that there's a substantive position underlying this recognition on the part of Moore, and it is the Russellian doctrine that demonstratives like this and that have to refer to things that you are perceptually acquainted with. We'll come back to that assumption when we look at Russell's treatment of the epistemology of our experience. But for right now, let's just let him have it. Let's let Moore and Russell have this claim. So you can't be acquainted with the hand itself, but at best only with the surface. Moore says, what is certainly true is the stuff of common sense. This is a human hand. And that's to be analyzed as there is a thing and only one thing of which it is both true that it is a human hand and that this surface is part of its surface. The second part is the referent of the term this. So at most, the word this can refer to the surface that's visible to you, the surface with which you are perceptually acquainted with. Then, what that forces Moore to take much more seriously than he had to this point is, how are we supposed to analyze the proposition, this is a part of the surface of a human hand? And he says, that's a question about the relation between a sense datum and the surface of the hand. This is one of the distinctive features of epistemology in the early part of the 20th century. You want to understand how perception works, and that's a question about the data that we get from our sensory organs. In short, it's a question about sense data. What is the relationship between the data we get from our senses and the world that's independent of our senses? What is that relationship? That came to be thought of as the problem of sense data. So there is a surface of the hand, and there is the data that we get from it, the particular perceptual acquaintance that we're experiencing. What's the relationship between these three? And here, Moore admits that he's not sure what the right answer is. He says there are three options. Perhaps the sense datum is part of the surface. Perhaps the sense data represents the surface. Perhaps something much more mysterious and mystical sounding and vague and Who knows what John Stuart Mill was talking about when he said this, but we'll come back to that in a moment. Go back to the first option. Suppose you think the sense datum just is itself part of the surface. He says there's two objections here. The first one not very serious, the second one much more serious. The first is that if that's true, we must give up the view that sense data always have the qualities they appear to have. The second, more problematic issue has to do with the stuff that the Refutation of Idealism paper didn't take into account. So think of double image cases. In double image cases, your sense datum has two objects in it. So maybe you're seeing double, right? So this is a hand. What you're seeing is one thing in some sense, but your perceptual state is of there being two things, two hands. Double image cases, Moore says, seem to suggest that the sense data only represents the surface rather than being part of it, because there really aren't two hands there, and there aren't really two independent surfaces. So the sense datum, it looks like, can't be part of the surface. So let's go and say, okay, let's turn to the representationalist view. The sense datum represents the surface. Moore worries that this lands us in skepticism. He says, look, if that's true, if the sense datum bears some relation R to a part of the surface, how can we know what thing it is which bears R to our sense data? You've got this thing out there, and you've got a sense datum, and the sense datum represents this thing. But the only thing you're acquainted with is the data of sense. So how do you know anything about X based on that? This is a standard skeptical worry. It plagued John Locke and other representationalists in the theory of perception. Maybe for good reasons, but maybe not for good reasons. The fact is, we don't have much else to go on than our experience when we're trying to figure out what the world is like. So the data of sense give us information about the world, and we use that data to figure out what the world is like. The skeptical argument that arises from this is very easy to see, to interpret as a kind of infallibilist worry. What can guarantee you that our sense data accurately represent the world as it is in itself? If you're a fallibilist, you say, well, that's a terrible standard. That's not what knowledge requires or involves. It would be a nice thing if we had infallible access to what the world is like. But you shouldn't conclude that if we don't have this absolutely magnificent and ideal connection to what the world is like in itself, that we can't know at all what the world is like. Maybe knowledge just doesn't require infallibility. So maybe this worry is a good one, and maybe it shows that Moore is too much influenced by infallibilists. Maybe he lost his Moorean arrogance at this point. Here's why. Notice Moore is very careful to insist that we not only know, but we know with certainty the things that are on his list. You should ask yourself, what is this notion of certainty? The most common one in the history of philosophy is infallibilism. To be certain is to be able to rule out any possibility of error whatsoever. That's infallibilism. If that's Moore's view, then lots of the things on his list are going to turn out to be hard to defend. There's a really famous, maybe it's a myth, but story about G.E. Moore that G.E. Moore once came to Wayne State in Detroit when Wayne State was a really fine place to be doing philosophy, and gave a talk. I'm not sure this is true because I worry. Moore retired in 1939, and the heyday of great philosophers being at Wayne State was in the 1960s and into the 1970s. So I suspect that this is a myth, and maybe the location is being misreported and it really happened somewhere else. But in any case, Moore was giving his defense of common sense paper, and they were in a room that had a skylight. And Moore was listing all of the things that he knows with certainty. And he looked up at the skylight and talked about the sun being on the other side. And it turned out the skylight was a fake. It wasn't really a skylight. It had a light behind it, but it wasn't the light of the sun. So there's a case where there was a possibility of error that Moore wasn't able to exclude. So he didn't know with certainty that the sun was on the other side of that skylight. Similar kinds of concerns can be raised for many of the things on Moore's list. So I've always thought that if you want to characterize the notion of certainty, don't do it in terms of infallibilism, but do it in terms of some exalted epistemic condition that you're in that puts you in a position to know. Start with that. If you're certain, then you're in a position to know, and perhaps your position to know couldn't be any better. This, by the way, is Chisholm's account of certainty. He doesn't use these words, but we'll see that that's what he's up to when we get to the 1950s. To be certain is to be in the highest position to know that you can be in. That's compatible, by the way, with fallibilistic knowledge. So it's the sort of thing that you should expect fallibilists to endorse. If you do endorse that, then it's not quite clear the force of this skeptical question anymore. The sense datum represents the surface. How can we know what thing it is which bears R to our sense data? Well, that's what theorizing is all about. You construct a theory. The data that you've got is the stuff of our senses. There's no guarantees that we have to be right about these things. But in any case, Moore seems to be way more sympathetic to skeptics at this point than we might have anticipated. So he turns to a third thing. Now notice his list of things doesn't exhaust logical space. This is just a list of possibilities. I think it's a list of things that people Moore knows about have said. This is a very easy trap to fall into when you're doing philosophy. You're talking about a particular topic or issue, and what you really want to do is get a grip on the logical space of options open to you. But you don't know how to do that. So what you do is you look at the historical options that have already been adopted by some people or other. So you turn to the history of philosophy. I think that's what Moore is doing here. Instead of letting the problem of perception govern the options he considers, he ends up letting the history of his acquaintance with philosophy govern his discussion. And that's how we get to the third possibility. This is what John Stuart Mill said. Things are permanent possibilities of sensations. So think about my coffee cup again. What is my coffee cup? Is it a material object independent of my perceptions or the possibility of perceptions? Mill wants to throw a bone to the idealists. He wants to say, no, a thing is really just a permanent possibility of being experienced. Now, if you're a realist, if you've been worried about possibilities of the matrix or Descartes' evil demon world or the possibility of unknowable truths, if there are unknowable truths, they might be truths about certain things. So let X be a thing regarding which there is an unknowable truth. And now ask yourself, ask John Stuart Mill, is this thing X a permanent possibility of sensations? Well, if you are a fallibilist and you think if we can have experiences of a thing, then our experience is the way in which we come to know about things. So if X is a permanent possibility of sensation, then it's the sort of thing that we can come to know about. But we already started from the assumption that, well, let me write this in a way that's a little more useful. We start out with the idea that X is the kind of thing regarding which there is no possibility of knowledge. Tilde, diamond, K. It's impossible to know anything about X. But if X is a permanent possibility of sensation, then X is the kind of thing regarding which we can get data from our senses. So somehow that data would have to be inadequate for knowledge. If you're an empiricist, though, you don't think that. I mean, perhaps there are things that can be experienced, but always in such an epistemically deficient way that we can't have any knowledge of them. That's certainly a possibility to consider. But there's some pressure on your view if you think X is completely unknowable. If you think there can be completely unknowable things, you are not an idealist. You are a realist in the sense we're talking about. And if you really emphasize the complete unknowability, undetectability, indiscernibility of a thing, there can be things that simply can't be permanent possibilities of sensations. Given that Moore is not much a fan of idealism, you would think he might be against this view on those kinds of realistic grounds, but he isn't. So he wants to consider maybe things, the objects themselves, are permanent possibilities of sensations. So what I know when I know about a sense datum are hypothetical facts of the form, if these conditions had occurred, then a sense datum just like this would have occurred. To which there are three objections. Now, before we get to the objections, let's make sure we understand what Moore is talking about. So take any object. This is John Stuart Mill's view. X can be analyzed metaphysically in terms of permanent possibilities of sensation. A permanent possibility of sensation is something that's expressible in terms of a conditional. A conditional of this sort. If the conditions, the perceptual conditions that you're in had occurred, then a sense datum just like this one would have occurred. There are all sorts of things to worry about. What is this just like this one supposed to mean? It's not a strict identity between one sense datum and another sense datum, because no two different sense data are identical with each other. So you can't say that. Just like this one has to be a remark about kinds of sense data. You'd have the same kind of sense datum. You also have to be careful about how you characterize the conditions. For example, suppose you characterize I'm looking at my coffee cup on my desk again. What are the conditions under which you'd have the same kind of experience? If the conditions are external to my mind, then the conditional isn't going to be a necessary truth because there are blind people. So the lighting could be the same in the room, physical distance from the object the same in the room, the head turned in the same direction, the eyes aimed in the correct position. All of that could be true, but blind people don't have the same kinds of sense data that I do. So now you have to give the conditions more thought, more careful formulation. They're going to have to include both internal and external elements. So you're going to have things like the capacity for vision. You're going to have things like, I don't know, what you're attending to. All sorts of things are going to have to be the case. Is this going to turn out to be a necessary truth? Anyway, can you have the object there, the coffee cup there, and yet the conditional be false? In that case, the coffee cup doesn't entail the condition in question, the conditional that is one of the permanent possibilities of sensation. So, for example, suppose you give a full statement of all the internal and external circumstances I'm in which I am having the experience of the coffee cup being on my desk. Ask yourself, is this conditional a necessary truth or not? If it's not a necessary truth, then it's possible for its antecedent to be true and its consequent to be false. Moreover, it looks like that combination of possibilities would also be consistent with the coffee cup being on the table. So list all of the internal and external conditions about me, the lighting in the room, the positioning of the objects in the room, including my physical body and all that. And yet, let there be a magician. Maybe it's Merlin the magician. Merlin, when I turn to look at the coffee cup, hexes my visual apparatus. Does that mean that the conditions are no longer the same? If you're pushed in that direction, then you are being pushed to insist that the only conditionals which can characterize these permanent possibilities of sensations are going to be necessary truths. Necessary truths, not merely contingent truths of one sort or another, but necessary truths. If you don't say that they're necessary truths, then it looks like you're not going to be able to defend the central entailment claim between the material object statement, that there is a coffee cup on my desk, with the conditionals that characterize the permanent possibilities of sensations. Because if Merlin's hexing my visual apparatus shows that the conditional in question is false, then it turns out that the coffee cup being on my desk doesn't entail any of these things. So go the other way and claim we do get the entailment because these conditionals are going to be necessary. Now you need a notion of necessity that's hard to come by. And it looks like the conditional is going to have a hard time characterizing this possibility of sensations. Possibility is a pretty weak notion. The coffee cup is on my desk. Does that mean there's a possibility of my seeing it? Does it imply that? Well, there is a possibility of my seeing it. Why? Because I have certain perceptual abilities. I can see things. There are lights available to turn on in case it's too dark to see things. So of course there's a possibility of my seeing it. Is that possibility properly characterized by a conditional that's necessary? That's going to be a hard claim to defend. In any case, John Stuart Mill's view is mysterious, troubling, in need of clarification and elaboration, but that's not Moore's objections to the view. Moore says this: when you refer to these conditionals, they seem to require reference to material objects in the antecedent. So if you were hoping to analyze away all of our statements, true statements about material objects, in terms of hypotheticals of this sort that don't refer to any material objects, you're going to have a hard time. And that was Mill's project, was to reduce material object statements to talk about permanent possibilities of sensations. Of course, you didn't have to be a reductionist of this sort to make the claim that John Stuart Mill made, but that's what he was up to. Second problem: sense data of the same kind can be the sensing of different objects. Now, this one is serious because remember, the identity, the just like this one, is supposed to be a kind difference, not a numerical identity between one sense datum and another one, since that would always be false. Everything is itself and not another thing, Bishop Butler said. Nothing could be truer. Okay, so you need sense data of the same kind, and this is troubling. You can have duplicate sense data of different objects. So the coffee cup can have a duplicate of it. And in the conditions that I've got, I would have had a sense datum just like the one I had. But then I can't identify my coffee cup with this possibility of sensation, since that possibility of sensation would be an actual sensation of a different object. So you're going to have to be able to group the sense data into their appropriate objects, and that's going to be hard for Mill to do. Finally, he's worried about the problem of illusory characteristics. The sense of round, square, and other empirical predicates seems to be radically altered if this view is correct. I'm not sure that's a good objection, but I think here's what he's thinking. Round things don't always look round. Square things don't always look square. They don't always look round either. What they look like depends on the perspective that you have on them. Now, sometimes the perspective reveals itself. So if you're looking at a square object that is very thin and you're relatively close to it, you can see the perspectival element involved in there being something about the data of sense that isn't square. But when you get far enough away from objects, the three-dimensionality that's necessary for picking out the perspective involved can no longer be detected. So in any case, we get some serious problems for the three views. The result is Moore is sort of uncertain how to solve the problem of perception. He thinks that the right way to think about things is the data of sense, when it comes to the referent to the word this, has to attach to what you're perceptually acquainted with, and so it can't refer to the hand itself, but rather must refer to the surface. But then he doesn't know how to characterize the relationship between the data of sense and the surface of the hand. So here's some summary remarks about Moore. In The Refutation of Idealism, every idea, including perceptions, are automatically the ideas of something extramental. In Proof of an External World, Moore is worrying a bit more about illusions, hallucinations, double image cases, after images, negative after images. It's a recognition of the inadequacy of the presupposition of his early view. We get this issue addressed more directly in A Defense of Common Sense, but what we get is Morean uncertainty. He doesn't know what to make of the problem of perception. Here's what we know then about G.E. Moore. Certain data is known, and what is known shows that most philosophers have either held false, inconsistent, or self-contradictory views. The task for philosophers is structured within the known data. Hence, there is a subject matter requiring philosophical work, but it's a quite different subject matter than many philosophers have thought. What you're supposed to be doing is not giving up the more obvious for the less obvious. So quit spending your time trying to undermine the more obvious by arguments and characterizations that are clearly nowhere near as obvious as the data with which you start. So the Morean common sense view is every theory answers to data. That's true in science, it's true in everyday ordinary life, and it's equally true in philosophy. So what are the data? The Morean view is that the data are the things that are the most obvious. There are still philosophical theories to be generated from this data, but you don't start out by questioning the data. Things will get more complicated when we start seeing that sometimes the data seem to conflict with each other, so there's going to have to be some adjustment. But that's the general Morean stance. So ask yourself this when you're thinking about G.E. Moore's stance. Why are the common sense views as the foundation on which philosophical activity is constructed? Why? Look at the list that he had in this paper. Why is that the list? What's not on the list that are generally assumed truths by most of human beings throughout history? Are there things that don't show up on the list? For example, religious views. For example, theism. Theism isn't on his list. What do you think Moore would say to explain why theistic views don't show up on his common sense list? Second, the most vexing of the Morean arguments is his argument, his claim that common sense views can't be known. The claim that the common sense views can't be known to be true. The people who defend that claim hold a contradictory position. That's worth thinking about further. Finally, could Moore accept the phenomenalistic position of Mill that objects are the permanent possibilities of sensation and still reject idealism? Remember, Mill claims that we can analyze material object statements in terms of statements about the permanent possibilities of sensation and statements about the permanent possibilities of sensation are conditionals of a certain sort. Could Moore accept, is there room in between the realism that Moore was defending and the idealism he's rejecting, so that in the home of the realists is the phenomenalistic position of John Stuart Mill? On the surface, it sounds like Mill's phenomenalism, where you identify material object statements in terms of something having to do with sensations, sounds a lot like Berkeley. Berkeley identified material object statements with sensations and ideas. Mill doesn't quite go that far. He instead talks about permanent possibilities of sensation. If we think of realism as the view that there are or can be unknowable truths, and idealism as the view that there can't be unknowable truths, look at the beginning parts of Royce's essay. Is there room in the realist position for John Stuart Mill, or is he committed to the idealist viewpoint? That's an interesting question about Mill himself that takes us outside the period of history that we're covering. More doesn't seem to be sensitive to these issues, doesn't, as far as I know, ever connect his worries about the truth or falsity of idealism with his sympathy for Mill's position. In any case, that's an interesting further question to be considering.